I am so excited to share with you in this video how to make a seeded sourdough sandwich bread. It has the perfect combination of the crunch from the seeds, the tanginess of the sourdough, a little whole grain goodness, and all in a sandwich shape that makes it really easy for you to make your favorite sandwiches. And in this video, I'll show you exactly how to make it, my favorite equipment, and my new favorite oval Cook Dutch oven. Even though I like to wing a lot of my recipes, this isn't one, and for best success I always recommend that you use a digital kitchen scale that I just tailored to the weight of the bowl for my stand mixer, and I'm adding water to it. Ideally, it should be warm water, but room temperature also works on a warm day. Here's my sourdough starter, which is super active. I'm very happy about that. And I'm adding my sourdough starter right to the water to activate it. And I'm going slow here. I could have used a utensil or a spoon, but sometimes I try to make things a little bit easier, and I don't know if in the end they are easier or a little bit harder because it might take a little longer. Anyhow, my sourdough starter goes right into the water here, and I'm going to save that for my next sourdough recipe. Here you can see it floats. That float test is not the most reliable test for the activity and the maturity of your starter, but it's always nice to see it floating in the water as it is. I like to use the, the square paddle for the stand mixer rather than the dough hook. And I'm just giving this a good whirl here because I want to activate the starter even further. For the grains, I'm using partly whole grains, and I have been experimenting with emmer berries. If you're not familiar with emmer, it's an ancient grain that has a fabulous taste, and I think it really adds to the taste and the flavor profile of this bread. If you can't find emmer or you don't have it at home, you can always use whole wheat berries. And then I'm adding some Khorasan berries. They're sometimes also called kamut. It's the same. One is a brand name and the other one is generic name. And this is about half of the recipe of flour here, and I'm weighing it. Again, you can also determine the ratio between the white flour and the whole grain flour. Anyhow, I just measured that, and I always love using fresh milled grains in my breads. Here's my mock mill high-speed grain mill. This is a 200 model, and it mills the flour in 200 grams in about a minute, and it's going pretty quick, but I'm just going to show you here how fine the flour comes out. You can make it a little coarser depending on the consistency you want for your bread. With a fresh milled flour, you retain all the goodness in the grains, and you're not going to lose any of the vital nutrients and oxidization, I couldn't even get that word out, that you might get if you use store-bought whole grain flour, which you can always do, of course. I'm adding that to the sourdough starter mixture here. I like to add the whole grain flours first because then they have a chance to absorb the water, because whole grain flour absorbs water a little bit differently than white flour, and this gives it a chance to absorb it. Now for the white flour, this is about a 50-50% recipe. I am just using regular all-purpose wheat flour. You can use any other flours you like, and you can always experiment with this recipe because it is so perfect. Once you make it the way I made it, and then if you're comfortable with it, you can always make it your own by different flours, different ratios, and different ingredients. Adding that to the bowl of my stand mixer, and somehow it's hard to get that all the way in there without spilling any. I could have removed the bowl, but then I have the mixing the paddle attachment, and then I would have to clean that. So I thought it would be easier to just wing it and add it right to the bowl. Now I am going to mix this for a while. I think that it gets better the longer you mix it. That's easy to do that with a stand mixer. If you're mixing it by hand, you can also just put it right on your kitchen counter, but I like to mix it for at least 5 minutes, but 10 minutes is not going to hurt your dough. It might actually help develop the gluten structure a little bit more than if you don't mix it for very long. I'm covering with a kitchen towel and let it rest for about an hour, and I'm putting my salt out there because sometimes I forget to add the salt. Now I add that last. That's called autolyse. I'm not 100% sure that it makes a huge difference for the final bread loaf, but most people will tell you autolyse is a good thing, so I am doing that. And now I need to mix the salt in to make sure it's evenly distributed. Now, before I'm going to add some stretch and folds, I scrape the dough away from the sides of the bowl. This will actually help. And with very wet hands, I stretch the dough and fold it over itself. Turn the bowl, stretch and fold it over itself. Turn the bowl, stretch and fold it over itself. And I do that a few more times until the dough kind of wants to resist it. And then I am done with this round of stretch and folds. Cover it back with a kitchen towel and let the dough rest at room temperature for 30 minutes. Again, wet your hands, and this is my second round of stretch and folds. This really helps if your dough is very sticky. Do resist the temptation to add more flour. Instead, do more stretch and folds and make sure you use wet hands. You can even wet your hands in between each stretching and folding to make sure that the dough is not sticking to your hands. It does stick a little bit to my hands here. Then I'm letting the dough rest for overnight. After I let it rise for another half hour to about an hour. That's always a little bit flexible, and it just depends also on how active your sourdough starter was and how warm your room temperature is. I'm adding a beeswax wrap and a bowl cover, and then I'm going to keep it overnight in my refrigerator where it will cold ferment. This video is sponsored by Cook, and first off I want to share with you their proofing kit. It has everything that you need to make this or any successful sourdough bread. It comes all neatly packed up, and let's see what I have to show you here. First of all, there's a little instruction handout, and then there's this bench scraper. It's metal. It has a nice wooden handle. Next up, we have a plastic dough scraper that comes in really handy when you're trying to transfer the dough from the bowl to your work surface. In this cardboard box, I am finding a bread lame. You can score the top of your bread with very intricate designs, and it has a nice little sleeve that you're not going to cut yourself if you have it in the drawer, and some replacement blades, which is really nifty if you go actually through those blades. And lastly, the oval proofing baskets. I really like them. They're fabric lined. And then my favorite new item is the Cook oval Dutch oven. It makes the perfect sandwich shape, which I've really come to love. And I have found that lining the Dutch oven with parchment paper really helps the bread not to stick and helps with removing it. And here I'm showing you how I'm just tracing the outline of the bottom of the Dutch oven on some parchment paper, and then I'm going to pull the parchment paper apart so I can then put it into the Dutch oven. I will leave the links for the products in the description box below, and also a nice 5% discount. I hope that you will check them out. And here is how easily and perfectly this piece of parchment paper fits right into the oval Dutch oven. Now the next morning, I am adding a lot of flour to my work surface because remember, this is still a very sticky dough, even though we've done a lot of stretch and folds, but it helps with what I'm going to do next. Here's the dough. It has some nice bubbles. There's some good activity that happened here overnight. I'm using my plastic bowl scraper, and I am trying to show you with my left hand, which is not my dominant hand. And I decided that it's really not for me to use my left hand, and unfortunately I can't show you exactly how I'm scraping the dough out of the bowl, but here you see, here it is. Just trust me on that one. Transferring it to my work surface. And this is the fun part where I am stretching the dough into a large rectangle. You can see that I am constantly flouring my hands a little bit to prevent it from sticking too much. And if the gluten has developed adequately, your dough shouldn't tear. You should be able to stretch it without it tearing, and it's a really fun activity actually. You can make it as small or as large as you want. Some people try to cover a whole table. That might help a little bit later in the baking with the development of the big holes, which I don't know that I find so practical, because if you're making a sandwich and you're adding something like mustard or mayonnaise, they tend to disappear in the holes. That's why I am not the biggest fan of the really large holes in the final bread loaf, but this really helps the oven rise. And beautiful how I can stretch it. It's actually really fun. You'll enjoy it. Before I'm adding the seeds to make that the seeded sourdough sandwich bread. And it doesn't have to be the perfect rectangular shape. Also, it's not very evenly stretched here. I'm not trying to win a contest. I think good enough is good enough. And for everyday sourdough bread, it doesn't need to be perfect, especially if you're just a beginner and trying out this recipe for the first time. Ready to add my seeds. You can use any combination of seeds. I always like a good helping of sunflower seeds. And by the way, the full recipe is in the description below this video. And you can also find a link for the Cook proofing set and the Dutch oven with a nice 5% discount for you. Then I have pumpkin seeds and sesame seeds. You can also use flax seeds, chia seeds. Here I have some black sesame seeds just for variety and a different color. Again, you can absolutely experiment with the amount and the combination of seeds you're using. I am now folding the dough over towards the middle by about 1/3, and then I fold over the other side, rolling it up into a long log, which now needs a little bit of surface tension that I create by gently pulling the dough towards me. And because it still is very sticky, I have a little bit of flour left there on my kitchen counter. I'm trying to drag it a little bit towards it, but I also want to drag it across those areas without flour to create that taut outside the surface tension, which will also help the loaf retain its shape, but also you can score it nicely. Here's the proofing basket. I never know how much I can trust those to not get stuck to the dough. That's why I add a lot of flour and then some sunflower seeds. You might get away with just adding seeds and no flour, which makes for a prettier surface of the final bread. By using my metal bench scraper, carefully transfer that dough log into the proofing basket. Here we go. And this recipe just fits perfectly. Actually, it's almost a little bit big, but it makes a good size loaf. I like to pinch the seams closed a little bit. It helps with the surface tension and prevents the loaf from falling apart and spreading out too much to the sides. Now I'm going to cover it with some plastic or beeswax and put it in the refrigerator for a few hours. I preheated my Dutch oven. You can see that there was a piece of parchment paper in the bottom of the Dutch oven and the lid, 450 degrees. And now I'm carefully transferring the dough into the hot Dutch oven. With my bread lame, I am scoring the top of the bread, which also helps it rise because it allows for the surface for the top of the bread to expand before the crust hardens. You can become very elaborate here with different types of scorings and shapes and designs. I'm just keeping it very simple with 3 straight diagonal lines. Now I'm using my pot holders, but I'm just going to show you really quick how you can use the handle that comes with the Dutch oven. You can hook that underneath the handle here and lift up the very hot lid. Back on, it's going back into the hot oven for about 30 minutes. And this is always my favorite moment, because before you can't see what it's doing, and checking up on the bread, what it looks like. Here's my handle. It's unfortunately a little bit out of the frame, but you can see how I'm using it to transfer it away. The bread has risen nicely with a very nice rounded top, and it goes back in the oven for another 30 minutes. Now it's finally done. About an hour, golden brown on top, perfectly risen, perfectly domed up on top. I like to take it out, and here you can see that with the parchment paper on the bottom, it comes right out of the Dutch oven. I have tried using it without a parchment paper, and I had to let it sit a little bit longer. Here it is, close up of your seeded sourdough sandwich bread. Now let's see what it looks like on the inside. The hardest part is letting the bread cool down until you can cut it, because once it comes out of the oven, it is still baking on the inside and still hot. So I recommend being very patient and waiting until it has cooled down enough that you can cut it. You can see the seeds in here, and it's got a nice airy crumb with some holes, not too big, just perfect. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.